Agile uses relative estimating. And one of the questions we have to answer, whether we're using traditional estimation or agile estimation, is how big is it? How much work do we have? Now, relative estimating works in a similar way to the way that we've traditionally estimated projects. The first thing is we have to ask, how big is something? And then answer the question, how much and how long? In relative estimating, what we're doing is we're coming up with how big something is by comparing it to something else we've done in the past, to something we know, and asking the question, is it smaller than the known project we've done in the past, or is it larger, or is it the same size? So this, when we're asking the question, how big, we're really trying to answer how much work do we have in our product backlog. Now, the very cool thing about relative sizing is that it leverages lessons learned. We've always known that the best way to do estimating was to use historical information, and that's part of the intent behind relative sizing. It's also based on the idea that as humans, we're better at judging how big something is compared to something else rather than guessing how big it is in terms of an absolute measure. If I ask you, how big is a house in square feet, y'all get guesses all over the map. On the other hand, if I ask you, is this house bigger or smaller than another house, you're probably able to answer that question quite easily. So this is really what relative sizing or relative estimating is taking advantage of. The ability to use historical information and the fact that humans are far better at comparing objects to one another than just trying to come up with an absolute size. So what we're doing is we'll take, if we want to understand how big something that we're about to take on is, we'll compare it to something that we already have done or we know how big it is. So you can imagine it sitting like on a balance scale here where we have one story and we have this new story. And we ask, is this new story that we have here bigger or smaller? And if it's the same size, the known story we said is a large story, the new story will be a large story. So this is kind of the way that we do it. And now we have to ask ourselves, okay, that's great. We can say one story is bigger than the other, but exactly what are we comparing these stories on? If I asked you here, which of these two images is bigger, you're going to look at it and go, well, what are you judging that on? Is it the size of the bowl or the size of the fish? So we have to come up with what are the traits or the attributes of the story or the backlog item that we're interested in that drive the size of that story. And what really makes one bigger or smaller than the other or the same size. So the comparison criteria that a lot of people advocate are, we look at a story or a backlog item and we say, okay, well, how much effort is there? Like, how much just raw work is there to be done? Well, that's a big driver of how big this is going to be. But the other question is, how complex is that work? For example, you may be writing a software module or an object or a class, and it might just be a lot of code. There may be 100, 1,000 lines of code in it, but it may be pretty simple and straightforward. There's just line after line after line. On the other hand, it could be a fairly complex algorithm that you're implementing. And that means, there's a lot of branching, there's a lot of loops. It has very, very high cyclomatic complexity. So that has definitely drives the size of the story. If it's got a lot of complexity, a lot of decisions that have to be made into it, it's certainly going to be bigger than one where there's just simply a lot of lines of code or a lot of things to be built. And then finally, there's uncertainty, right? How confident do we feel that, we know what we're going on, or it's kind of iffy. So, you might think of this as your contingency that you're building in. What effort or what it's going to take to really understand what this story is about. So what's your doubt about the ability surrounding the story? So these are kind of the attributes or the traits of the story that you would look at to say, how big is this thing? And what we can do then is to show an example how stories might compare. Let's say we've got our first story here, and it's got a moderate amount of complexity. It's not a lot of effort, but you can imagine it's one of those complex units that we're having to design, and we have some doubt surrounding it. And then on the other hand, we have another story where there's not very much complexity, but boy, there's a lot of effort to doing that, and probably not a lot of uncertainty. And then we have story 3, which has got a huge amount of complexity in it, not a lot of effort, and it's got a lot of doubt about it. So this kind of gives you how we might measure these stories. And then when we put these pieces all together, it might look something like this. We got story 1, story 2. They have different efforts and complexity, but they're about the same size. Whereas story 3, it's clearly a lot bigger. And then what we can do is arbitrarily go into what's known in the Agile community as T-shirt sizing. We can give these a very simple, medium and large, right? And initially, when we're first starting this up, to calibrate the model, we may arbitrarily say what constitutes a large story and what constitutes a medium-sized story and what constitutes a small story. But then we can build up a historical database on this. But this kind of gives you the idea of how we start coming up with, here's a medium story, here's a large story. And what we're looking for then when we bring a new story into the mix is how well does it compare to what we called a medium versus what we called a large. And this is how we start building up our historical data of stories to say, when we have a new one, does it look more like the large story or does it look more like the medium story?